I'm Jeff Bibby, Vice President of Marketing for Zix. Happy to spend some time today talking about the overall need for email security. As part of our role as a leader in the email encryption space, we are doing this session to just provide some education on what is necessary to have an overall email security program. And who better to do that with than none other than the world's most famous hacker, Kevin Mitnick, former black hat, now white hat hacker. Kevin, nice to see you.
Nice to see you again.
Yeah, it was exactly 1 year ago at this time we actually talked about how simple it was to be able to hack an email. Today we're going to broaden that a bit and talk about some other topics related to ransomware, related to talking about the issues related to TLS. But why don't we begin with just maybe you giving it a bit of your background for those that don't know. What causes people to say that you're the world's most famous hacker?
My involvement in computer hacking actually started about 30 years ago in high school. I was fascinated with the telephone system and ended up getting involved in this hobby called phone phreaking. And phone phreaking was kind of exploring the telephone network. It was the same hobby that Steve Jobs and Steve Wozniak had back in the mid-70s. And I was really fascinated by how the phone system worked. And I was also a prankster, so I loved doing things like manipulating the telephone network, for example, by changing a friend's home phone by gaining access to the switch to a payphone. So whenever he or his parents tried to make a call, it would say deposit 25 cents. And so I got really involved in this phone phreaking stuff. And then the phone company was moving from electromechanical systems into electronic switching systems, and they had a bunch of computers that would control the front end. So that's when I became involved in computer hacking, more for the intellectual curiosity, the pursuit of knowledge, and to pull pranks. And I ended up getting myself in a bunch of hot water. I started this hacking even before there was laws against doing it. And after I got myself into a lot of trouble, I actually served time in prison, I basically reinvented myself because the whole landscape of security changed from when I started doing this back in the 70s and 80s. Now, if we fast forward to the 2000, people were very concerned about their security. Companies, the internet had just pretty much evolved from the ARPANET. Companies were doing transactions on the internet, and people were very concerned about security. So naturally, security became a field. And I pretty much do what I did as a youngster that got me into trouble, but I do it with authorization. So clients hire myself and members of my company to basically hack their systems, to test their physical, their technical, and their human factor security, so we could find the vulnerabilities so the company could shore up their defenses before the bad guys do. So that's what I do today.
Awesome. So perfect person to have this conversation with us today. So that struggle to secure information obviously is still very alive and well. We help people at Zix with encryption of information and email in transit. But one area that we want to provide a little bit more dialogue and education is this very active area of ransomware. So April this year, particularly the healthcare space has been hit hard. There was an April Wall Street Journal article talking about, unfortunately, some organizations actually had to pay the ransomware. Why don't you just maybe give us a little bit of an overview of what ransomware actually is and things that you see in your pen testing capabilities that people could do to prevent it?
Yeah, ransomware is a piece of insidious malware, and basically how attackers are getting how they're getting this malware into companies is usually through what we call social engineering, where they're able to trick a user to click on an attachment in an email or click on a hyperlink, and what happens, it installs malware. Now, this variant called ransomware is really problematic because a lot of companies haven't tested their backup and restore solutions. So a lot of companies, if some disaster happens, it's really difficult to restore from, for example, from 24 hours earlier. And this is where ransomware really hits people, because what this malware does is when it's installed on some victim's computer, it goes out onto that victim's computer, it goes out onto any network shares they have access to, and it simply encrypts the files. And in fact, I had a recent experience with a client I was pen testing. During the pen test, one of their employees clicked on, the email came in about a billing statement for a credit card, saying the credit card is going to be canceled unless the payment is made. They had an attached zip file. The employee clicked it, and it basically installed this ransomware called Locky. So what happened is it scrambled the file names and put the extension .locky and did this to hundreds and hundreds of files. Pretty much every file that this particular lady had access to on her own computer, but also on the network shares, right? So basically what had happened is after this was all scrambled and encrypted, she gets a pop-up, a screen that pops up and says, if you want to get access to your files again, you have to pay us 1 Bitcoin. Bitcoin is a electronic currency, and this is what the bad guys like because they kind of bury their transactions and make it very anonymous, so they're obviously not identified. And what happens is if you pay the Bitcoin ransom, usually they'll give you a key to restore the files, right? In some cases, like a recent hospital that was hacked, they gave a key to restore some of the files, but then demanded $40,000 more, right? And what the problem is, what this exploits is human gullibility. People inside corporations that are very busy doing their daily tasks, they get an email, they don't really have time to really think about the email, and they just, they're just in the habit of clicking. And the malware gets installed because their antivirus solution didn't catch it. And of course, the real downside of why this really hurts companies is they really don't test their restore process. So when they're backing up their files on full backups or incremental backups and they're trying to restore it, when they try to restore, they realize the tape they written to was bad, or something happened in that process. Now they're stuck. Now they're stuck having to pay that ransom. And this malware is basically going viral because these guys that are behind these attacks are making multi-millions of dollars, right? It's basically an automated process. In fact, I had one client contact me. They wanted to hire us to basically try to crack the key to the malware. And then I go, well, how much are the bad guys wanting you to pay? And they go, about $500. I said, it's actually cheaper to pay the ransom than hiring any security company just to try out the $500. And they did it, and fortunately they got all their files back, right? But in a lot of cases, you can't really trust that somebody's not going to ask for a further ransom or get you further down the line.
Yeah.
So this ransomware is really, really bad. And what companies, like for example, I'm involved in a company called KnowBe4.
Yeah. And
what we do is we offer IT departments the ability to spearfish their own employees. So we actually, have a library of the latest phishing attacks, and the IT department gets to essentially stage these fake attacks on the workforce to see who's going to click, who's going to open up that attachment, who's going to click on that Java applet, who's going to click on that hyperlink. So when somebody does it, we could explain, hey, this was a mistake you made, and and further train them. It becomes a very teachable moment. Right. So there's tools that companies could use to mitigate this: user education and training, inoculation, by making sure that their disaster recovery processes are in place and they actually work.
Okay. So back to basics, really. I mean, making sure you've got discipline in place to keep the user training going, and really kind of be relentless with it.
But a lot of companies have user education and training. I mean, it's usually mandatory, like even for PCI compliance. But the problem is no matter how you train a person, there's always going to be people that are susceptible. So the best way is, I look at it like a flu shot, right? If you could, how does that work? You give somebody a small dose of the virus and they build up antibodies to fight the real one when it comes along. This is kind of the thinking that we have at KnowBe4, is we give that small dose that is not a lethal dose that's going to hurt anybody, and then hopefully that inoculates them against the real bad guy that will inevitably come with an attack in the future.
Okay, all right. Let's talk a little bit. We'll shift direction here a bit and talk just about the overall email landscape and
how that's like changed today, and now how you have the bad guys targeting email because it's such a target-rich environment. In fact, when I'm doing pen testing, the first thing that we'll want to get access to is the email spools, usually in Exchange, and we'll search those for certain keywords like password, ASSW, right? PASW, PW, and certain types of phrases people will have in an email. Sometimes they try to be clever and they won't spell the word out password, but they'll put PW or CRED, CRED. So we'll search for these keywords in these email spools. And even though companies have policies, you're not supposed to send passwords to email, everybody does.
Why do you think we still, in this day and age, are seeing examples like John Brennan or Mrs. Clinton, where they're using a consumer-based mail system for sensitive information? What do you think causes someone to not understand how bad of an idea that is?
Well, they probably don't understand the risks. It's an illusion of invulnerability. Like Clinton, for example, from what I understand, she was pretty much set on using a particular mobile phone device, I think a BlackBerry. And the Department of Homeland Security said, oh no, you're not using this device for email. You're going to have to switch over to this one. And she goes, oh, I'm not going to do this. So she sets up an email server in her home. Probably one that she's already used in the past for personal emails, and now starts to do Department of State business using that email server, completely oblivious to the potential of getting attacked, right? And not thinking about security through obscurity. For example, John Brennan, the CIA director, had confidential email about himself. I forgot what the form is called. Maybe it's an SS-34. It's a form that you submit to the Office of Personnel Management. And it has all your background stuff, your psychological reviews, your medical history, just basically all about you. There's nothing in that document that doesn't exist. And he had this sitting in his AOL account. And some 20-year-old found a mobile phone number that belonged to the guy and found out it was registered to Verizon, calls Verizon, social engineers them out of his Verizon PIN code, his other phone numbers that are assigned to the account, and more importantly, his email address. And his email address was an email at AOL.com. Like, who uses AOL in 2015-16? So what these hackers knew, and what is commonly known in the security industry, is a lot of email providers reset your email password or your email address, or your email address really, then you can do the password reset, is if you have the payment information. So from Verizon, they got the last four digits of the credit card number used to pay his Verizon account, and it just so happens he used the same one at AOL. They gave AOL the last four of the credit card number, they put a different email address, they did a password reset, and now had access to the CIA director's email. I mean, simple attack using social engineering, and they're able to pull that off. He didn't encrypt his email, which you would think that somebody in an intelligence agency, NSA, CIA, that they know the basics. Any type of data that you need to protect from prying eyes, you encrypt it. And he simply didn't do it. And I think, it's a speculation on my part, it was security through obscurity. Is the guy probably goes, nobody knows I really have an AOL account. It might have been Jay Brennan at AOL.com. It's not going to say CIA director. And he's probably figuring that nobody is even going to know it's there. So it's not going to be attacked. And lo and behold, some 20-year-old figures it out, and it's on CNN the next day.
Well, let's keep going with that topic of business email and talking about encryption. So one of the areas that someone could look to attempt to encrypt email in transit is through reaching for what they would look at as a free, readily available solution, and that's TLS. Let's talk a little bit about some of the flaws related to TLS and why that would be a very bad idea to be your sole source of encrypted email.
Well, security researchers have found bugs in TLS. I mean, I'm not going to get into the details like bugs with how the compression works. What the whole idea is they found attacks like what we call downgrade attacks, where they could trick the person's browser into using some encryption scheme that has been broken, for example. Is what the whole idea is to be able to usually get the cookie, the sign-in cookie, because if you could steal a person's cookies from their browser, well, now you're them. You don't even have to authenticate anymore, right? And there's been plenty of attacks. There's been Beast, there's been Crime, there's been Poodle. These are names of particular attacks on the TLS protocol, because TLS is just like any other service. It's pretty much a computer program or application, if you will. I don't really call it an application, it's more a protocol. And there are security researchers out there that are really good at analyzing protocols, finding the bugs and exploiting them.
Right. So if put in properly, TLS can be great. If using it and you are using it, with properly managing it, then it can be effective. But maybe let's talk a little bit about the burden that you have to have with actually just setting it up and managing
configuration issues, right? And don't forget, with the attacks I talked about before, those are all man-in-the-middle attacks.
Right.
So now the hacker has to get between you, the sender, Alice, let's say, and the receiver, Bob. They have to get in the middle of that transaction to actually pull off those types of exploits. It's not that I know, oh, Jeff Beebe over here has this email address, I'm going to hack his TLS connection. That's not going to work. You have to be the man in the middle.
Right.
But with configuration issues, that's a big thing, because a lot of times the server isn't configured right. The server, under the common name, right? So now when somebody's connecting via TLS, it creates vulnerability, right? So you have the issues with configuration. You have the issues with being able to steal the encryption keys. When we're doing pen testing, for example, and we'll, for example, compromise an Exchange server, we know exactly what directory to look in for the public key and private key. Now, once we have that, if we're the man in the middle again, we could use a tool called Wireshark, which allows us to monitor traffic on the wire and actually load in the private key and watch everything in the clear, right? So there's definitely attacks on configuration, there's attacks on stealing the keys, there's attacks, compression attacks, downgrade attacks. I mean, no protocol is absolutely perfect. There's vulnerability pretty much in everything.
Right. So then you have to have the staff necessary to be able to actually configure properly. And then if it's not configured properly, so what we would describe as mandatory TLS, say somebody puts it in as opportunistic, maybe talk a little bit about some of the
difference between opportunistic TLS and mandatory TLS is opportunistic TLS, basically if the sender doesn't support that encrypted connection, it will downgrade and send it in the clear.
Right.
Mandatory TLS, if the sender doesn't support it, we say, oh, the server says, oh, can't communicate with you. So now, what's going to happen is who's going to manage that, right? Because now who's going to configure that mandatory TLS? Who's going to set up that configuration and do it properly? But definitely, I'd err on the side of mandatory TLS. Don't forget, you have no choice of who you communicate with as well.
Right.
You could be sending, email to some mom and pop company. Right. And they've just how they configure services on their side, you have no control of.
Right.
So you're stuck with what they have.
Yeah. No, and that's huge, and that's why we design our system the way we do. That the Zix gateway actually starts. It first looks for an S-MIME attempt, and then after that, if it doesn't get it, then there's fail-safes that actually start to kick in after that, so that you're never actually sending it in the clear. I guess one of the other things that we hear about with respect to if somebody was just reliant on TLS is that the person doesn't actually know whether the message was encrypted. There's no way for the recipient to know that the message came in encrypted. So
that's true.
It can be a drawback. What we like to do to the Zix system actually will insert a blue banner across the top of the encrypted message, even if it is TLS. And furthermore, there's no reporting, right? So you don't have any way of actually, if you put TLS in with a hope to being able to actually show what you did to encrypt your messages, you don't actually have any means of being able to report on that later on. So it becomes a bit of a drawback for you.
Yeah, that's true. I mean, TLS is pretty much, when people use SSL, which uses TLS, you're not really thinking about it. You're basically, hey, I'm connecting to gmail.com or Hotmail or Outlook or whatever you want to, what you do in a consumer environment, you're not thinking about it. You're just looking, oh, if that lock is there, hey, I'm secure, everything, is encrypted, I'm good.
Yeah.
Some people don't even understand the difference between, encryption in transmit and encryption at rest.
Right.
People just don't get it. They don't think about it. But, that's absolutely true, is TLS isn't designed for reporting or compliance. It's basically basically just simply a protocol.
Point-to-point protocol.
A point-to-point protocol.
Yep.
It's a point-to-point protocol that's been compromised before. It's difficult to compromise. It's not a trivial type of attack. I was actually looking the other day for code out there that exploits a lot of the vulnerabilities, and they actually had one for Poodle, but it's actually a more of a complex attack. So there's issues at the endpoint that people need to be concerned about, and when the data is in transit. And that's where you guys, shine in that area, is when that email is going from point to point, right? And not simply relying on one protocol, which is obviously doesn't have any reporting mechanism. You simply don't know. You just assume that the email was sent securely because you're seeing that lock.
Right. And that's why we're here. I mean, that's exactly why we're here, just to help people understand that it can be effective if you have the staff to manage it and can manage it point to point. There are places for its use, but expecting that it's going to be something that you could turn to for encrypting email in transit across everyone that you communicate with is definitely unrealistic and unreasonable.
Yeah, like for example, so what happens, like let's say I'm at a company ABC, I have your solution, and I send an email to Bob, and Bob doesn't use encryption, right? So what happens in that particular case?
Yeah, well, it's simple for us. It's we would look up, see that we don't have Bob in the Zix directory, and then send Bob a notification message saying he has an encrypted email he needs to come and pick up, and it's very simple for him to pick that up. So it's really quite clean.
So we need solutions that do this more transparently, and where the user doesn't even have to think about it.
Right. Couldn't agree more. So that's great. That's really what we wanted to achieve today, is give people a little bit more knowledge in this whole area, and appreciate you spending the time to talk about that.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for having me.
Yeah.